Welcome back to Making It Awkward. I'm Jessica Wilson, your host today for a couple topics that I've been wanting to discuss and unsure how to introduce. Today, Dr. David Wiss presents this opportunity. He's a dietitian specializing in treating eating and substance use disorder. He and I talk about eating disorders, ultra-processed foods, or UPFs, food addiction, and hyperpalatable foods. I came across Dr. Wiss's work via an email from an academic researcher who was concerned about a recent comment in the Journal of Eating Disorders co-authored by Dr. Wiss and Drs. Timothy Brewerton and Kim Dennis. The title of the comment is Dismantling the Myth of All Foods Fit in Eating Disorder Treatment. The journal comment gives, quote, a review of the evidence that indicates the folly of these assumptions and show there are a variety of exceptions to these rules. 1, food allergies, sensitivities, and intolerances. 2, religious and spiritual preferences or doctrines. And 3, deep breath. The ubiquitous emergence and widespread availability of ultra-processed foods leading to the potential development of addiction-like eating and a higher prevalence of various medical and psychiatric comorbidities, as well as higher mortality. End quote. In addition to discussing food allergies, intolerances, and specifically the impacts that foods have on migraines, it makes specific claims like, quote, a diet characterized by higher consumption of whole fruits and vegetables may be protective against ADHD, end quote. And there may be times when it is indicated and appropriate, even in patients who may have or have had eating disorders, to support rather than pathologize a patient's desire to lose weight, end quote. A bit after that line, the comment discusses the importance of advocacy for both body neutrality and weight-inclusive care. The co-authored comment also includes that, quote, up to 80% of food advertising promotes ultra-processed foods and drink products, with food companies often targeting communities of color. The eating disorder community disregarding the role of the food supply chain and systemic racism in food access further compounds the racial inequities marginalized communities face with regard to accessing culturally attuned, comprehensive eating disorder care. End quote. Now, I politely declined a colleague's invitation to write a response to the Journal of Eating Disorders about this comment because the eating disorder establishment isn't the target of my work, and writing a response to this would reinforce its value when I'm more into dismantling it and showing the benefit to investing in things like the BIPOC Eating Disorder Conference instead. That said, talking to Dr. Wiss was something I was interested in. I was curious about the inspiration for the article and the experiences that influenced it. I was interested in hearing how he works with clients and how his passion for addressing food addiction developed. I was also interested in how he was defining ultra-processed foods, having seen his articles list pastries and tortilla chips as UPFs. I'm excited to bring you those answers today and begin what will hopefully be an ongoing exploration of food addiction, hyperpalatability, and whether I can ever truly be able to define an ultra-processed food. As you likely guessed, this will be at least a 2-part episode. A follow-up will air in 2 weeks and will include thoughts and feedback from listeners. Dr. Wiss's journal comment is linked in the show notes, as are a few additional articles mentioned in this chat. If you'd like to share your thoughts on this episode, you can send an email or voice memo to makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com. The follow-up interview will also include an interview I have with an eating disorder researcher about the claims made in this comment. This is also the first episode in which I got to say the phrase, shit my pants, but no need to give feedback or commentary about that. And a note to listeners here, this episode might be a complicated listen for people in eating disorder recovery and for those who have a tendency to see food in a binary of good and bad. Take care of each other out there. With that, I'll introduce Dr. Wiss and we'll get right into it. Dr. David Wiss became a registered dietitian nutritionist in 2013 and founded Nutrition and Recovery, a group practice of RDNs specializing in treating eating and substance use disorders. He earned his PhD in public health with a minor in health psychology from UCLA. Dr. Wiss is a scientific author with over 20 peer-reviewed publications, a nutrition and health consultant, functional medicine practitioner, recovery coach, and passionate educator. Dr. David Wiss, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
What population of folks do you typically see in your eating disorder practice?
My private practice is called Nutrition in Recovery. So I built a niche for people in substance use disorder recovery. And so I really have collaborated with a lot of treatment centers here in West Los Angeles, and
Hmm.
we bring eating disorder informed care to addiction treatment centers. So it comes in the form of groups and one-on-one, and I get a lot of referrals from the private sector addiction
Hmm.
treatment industry.
Yeah. How'd you start marrying those two patient populations?
I saw a need. I saw the need.
Yeah.
I have a personal history with addiction recovery, so I was very attuned to the need for nutrition education in that space. And it became obvious to me very quickly that there was a lot of people with disordered eating inside of addiction treatments. Some
Hmm.
are, what we'd call subclinical, subthreshold, and some are full blown,
Hmm.
and people are sometimes avoiding eating disorder treatment or have gone and decided they're never going to go back again, or are just having comorbid, co-occurring stuff, which is
Totally.
quite common. So,
Yeah.
I pretty much became, eating disorder focused dietitian just based on the fact that that's who was asking for help and that's who was getting referred in.
Yeah. How do you work with your patients that might be different than, say, a typical eating disorder practice?
I would say that I'm I'm atypical in the sense that I do not believe in having a food philosophy. I
Hmm.
do not believe that having a model is helpful to people. I think
Hmm.
that it could actually be quite the opposite. So I'm a scientist and I believe in really figuring out where people lie on continuums and spectrums and not thinking about them as their diagnoses. And really, I think the biggest difference is that I incorporate a lot of neuroscience
Mm.
into the work that I do.
What does that look like?
I think it's really just an understanding of neurochemical reward.
Hmm.
So, how the dopamine system works to motivate behavior,
Hmm.
how the dopamine system works to remember salient experiences, to assign them value, and to essentially use those experiences, whether they be substances or behaviors,
Hmm.
to reduce negative emotionality, to help people cope with life as a form of self-medication for trauma. So truly just being able to see how profound
Hmm.
food and other substances, including caffeine, nicotine, any sort of dopaminergic substance, how profound that is in terms of the human brain and human behavior. And I saw that that was rather ignored in the mainstream eating disorder conversation. There
Hmm.
didn't seem to be a strong acknowledgement of reward based processes, addiction like processes. And I think that would be what I've tried to add to the
Hmm.
sort of mainstream eating disorder conversation, which is that there's actually a lot more biology to think about rather than just the psychosocial factors of interest.
This is super helpful context. I was going to ask what inspired you to write the essay, but this is very related to the content of the essay. Do you want to fill that out and your inspiration to write it?
So the comment that you're referring to is dismantling the myth that all foods fit
Hmm.
in eating disorder treatment. That actually has quite a long legacy. My co-authors are both
Yeah.
psychiatrists that I have collaborated with
Mm.
academically and clinically for
Hmm.
many years. And the main author, Dr. Timothy Brewerton, who's a friend and colleague of mine, we've actually written quite a few papers over the years
Hmm.
about co-occurring eating disorder, substance use disorder, and going back as far back to 2016. One of my first big publications was about how do we incorporate this emerging science on food addiction and ultra processed food addiction to specific types or subtypes of eating disorders, really, especially those that had a history of substance use disorder and a history of trauma. So, thinking about different phenotypic presentations, not just the classic diet culture restrictor, thin white female, right?
Hmm.
The classic
Hmm.
conceptions of eating disorders, don't fit. The majority of people that end up needing help. Maybe it fits a big chunk of the people that end up seeking help, but there's a difference between those that are seeking help and those that are needing help. And so we've written about this quite a bit over the years. Yeah, the 2016 paper was called the DFANG, the Disordered Eating, Food Addiction, Nutrition Guide, that just suggested that these things were non-binary, that it wasn't just either someone has this condition or not, that there are people that are on a spectrum of addiction-like behaviors that have different reward responses to food, and that would warrant different types of nutrition interventions, as opposed to saying everyone should get the same food plan. Maybe there's someone that's more on an addiction spectrum that should be on a lower exposure type of a meal plan in a treatment setting. And the paper was great. It didn't have a lot of background on PTSD and adverse childhood experiences. So we wrote another one in 2020, which was called Separating the Signal from the Noise. And I'm very proud of that work because we really proposed steps that one could take to understand if someone is on this addiction continuum and if it's clinically relevant, because we know that people who diet a lot or restrict, as we call it, might give false signals of addiction-like eating. It might look like food addiction, but it probably might just be a relic of under nutrition, restriction, etc. So I've worked really hard in separating, creating nuance. And I think it's probably safe to say that while a lot of this work has been super scientific, super two-sided, there's been a lot of pushback from the eating disorder field. And I think a lot of it comes from the quote unquote anti-diet community, proponents of intuitive eating, the people that have I'm going to say this with love, right? A single food philosophy, right? They've got one way of seeing the world, and it doesn't seem like there's room because of the emotions and the personal experience, the lived experience that might bias it, and all the other social justice issues that are enmeshed in these conversations. It seemed like there was a lot of resistance to the work that we were doing. And I think, if I'm honest, it's very clear where a lot of it comes from. And it comes from, I think, the all foods fit philosophy. If someone stands by that philosophy, then it seems like anything that goes against or counter to that philosophy is seen as a threat. And it's seen as a disorder. And it's seen as someone being a proponent of diet culture. And as someone that practices clinically, very, very busy. I'm the owner of a group practice, right? A lot of experience working with people, one-on-one and in settings. And I'm very much attuned to the scientific literature and trying to bring that all together. I bridge the gap between what we do in the field and what we observe in universities and in academic context. And so I think this commentary came out of a need to push a little bit. You could tell the title is pretty strong. The phrase dismantling, you are certainly familiar with. And I believe that it became quite obvious to us that this idea that all foods fit is the only possible treatment trajectory for someone who has any form of an eating disorder became a toxic myth. It just became a toxic myth. And we've really focused on just identifying a couple of reasons why it's a myth. And the one that's, I think, the most interesting or important is the emerging data on ultra-processed food addiction. I think that's the one that I had interest in collaborating on this paper to express and summarize.
Can I have you pause there so I can run back up to the things that I've been taking notes on as we've been going down? But thank you. I do want to come back around to that one. Low exposure meal plan is super new. Had not heard it before. Can you tell me what that looks like?
Yeah. So I think treatment as usual in the eating disorder space includes the Western diet, as we sometimes call the standard American diet, which is, usually having some degree of palatability to it, in the form of refined grains, added sugars, deliciousness, right? I think, there are people who have certain types of brains to where when food is palatable enough, it becomes very difficult to be in touch with one's hunger and fullness, to pump the brakes, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one of the problems with this food addiction versus eating disorder conversation is that
Mm-hmm.
it seems like the classic eating disorder model, if all foods fit, is let's eat more of these foods. Let's do exposure, right?
Okay.
To normalize
Mm-hmm.
the experience of eating added sugars to foods, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this sort of food addiction perspective, which is like no grains, no added sugars, right? Very bland. And I think that approach is common, like in some of the 12-step programs and
Yes.
some of the very, I think most people would call them rigid. And
Mm-hmm.
and I would use that word, but I use that word with love because I know a lot of people that
Mm-hmm.
have those types of disorders and that do benefit from that type of a food plan. But I've worked hard to conceptualize different layers of exposure
Mm-hmm.
between like the no sugar and the cookies at every meal, right? So low exposure
Okay.
means that you're essentially eating mostly whole, unprocessed, or minimally processed foods. And there is obviously some room for some foods that have sauces, for desserts, for snacks, but it's not baked into the meal plan like all day, every day, the way a lot of contemporary eating disorder treatment centers do.
Okay.
So it's a lower exposure, meaning there's lower amounts of foods that are highly rewarding. It's a little bit less hedonic on the
Mm-hmm.
spectrum, but it's
Mm-hmm.
not like what some people would call an abstinence food plan. It's a harm reduction model. And I believe that there's a lot of layers of exposure between a bland diet and
Mm-hmm.
the standard American diet
Mm-hmm.
that could be thought about in terms of treatment and recovery. I think, of course, someone could get off in the weeds with thinking about, what is the right amount of,
Sure. Yeah.
yeah, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
have answers for that, but I do think that there is a whole continuum of
Mm-hmm.
possibilities
Mm-hmm.
between high exposure, minimal or no exposure, and then a whole world of harm reduction in between.
Can you help me? I'm so glad. I wanted to explore hyperpalatability like a zillion times. So I'm glad that you brought it up. I have read like this perfect combination of foods and ingredients that make something hyperpalatable. I've read those, and that is interesting. The quantification of those things, the fractions, I'm very impressed with whomever is doing that. And I struggle with that. And like, say, when pluot season is in, my dad has 2 different trees. I say, I'm only going to eat 2. If I don't, I'm going to shit my brains out. And then I'm eating 5.
Okay.
So, like, how am I getting the same reward? Like, I eat a whole pound of cherries and fully regret it for like a full week. Like, I
Mm,
have lost all sensation. So, like,
yeah.
there is no fractioning there of like sauces and whatnot. So, what
I've
am
had
I
Yeah, I've had
experiencing?
this conversation quite a bit. I think that there are people that are going to have a heightened reward response to minimally processed foods. So this
Okay. Okay.
includes fruits and for
Yeah.
some people, nuts, right? And
Okay.
even for some people, grains. Obviously, there's a big
Yeah.
difference between white flour and quinoa and farro. But there are people who have reported loss of control eating over quinoa and farro, right?
Mm-hmm. Oh,
My
yeah.
personal interest, because of the neuroscience piece and because of the data that we have on
Mm-hmm.
food processing using the NOVA classification, we have
Right.
4 categories.
Mm-hmm.
I am most interested in, learning and studying and targeting the effects of ultra processed foods on the
Okay.
brain.
Okay.
And the reason is because once we have enough data there, we can start to leverage public health and public policy. I
Got
don't
it.
think that there's anything that we're going to ever really do about someone's loss of control around cherries or macadamia nuts other than
Yeah.
treat the individual. You
Okay.
can help someone, with mindfulness and with nutrition. There's ways to help someone regulate. But
Mm-hmm.
the conversation around ultra processed food addiction
Mm-hmm.
is more of a systemic structural conversation, because if we have data, which was
Mm-hmm.
emerging pretty rapidly, that it
Mm-hmm.
is the chips, the candy, the soda, we might be able to do something about it. Not tomorrow, probably not next year, but
Sure.
maybe in a decade or two.
Okay. Um, so you mentioned a harm reduction approach and with the food, and I'm curious about like what is the harm and what is the reduction in this context?
Sure. It would certainly depend on the person, but if we're talking about ultra processed food addiction, the
Mm-hmm.
harm is overactivating the dopamine system, overactivating the brain's reward pathways
Okay.
so that it basically makes it difficult for someone to be present in their life, to feel joy, to
Okay.
be able to move through life.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone has ever had an addiction, whether it be alcohol or drugs, it is the thief of joy because it hijacks your brain. It
Mm-hmm.
makes it very difficult for one to think about other things, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
spend a lot of time preparing for the substance. When you're using it, you're usually hyper focused on it. There's some time spent recovering from it. There's usually some resolutions not to do it again. The mind, right, comes back and it basically, prevents someone from having freedom of thought, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, when we think about the harm associated with ultra processed food addiction, of course, there's other clinicians and scientists that would have rattle off a whole list of metabolic related issues and sure, blood sugar, GI, you name it. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in it as a behavioral problem, thinking about how food and how addiction like behaviors impact one's ability to show up for their
Mm-hmm.
life and be useful.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if someone were to be eating highly palatable foods all day long,
Mm-hmm.
it really could take up a lot of someone's cognitive resources, right?
Okay.
And the
Uh-huh.
reason why people like abstinence based approaches, and this is why 12 step programs exist and why people gravitate towards food addiction communities, is because
Mm-hmm.
when you do put the brakes on, ultra processed foods that are very neurochemically stimulating, people do report being able to feel a sense of freedom. And that is the thing that really gets people more interested in recovery. I think there's a lot of vanity there too. People want to lose weight, and of course, right? But I'm most interested in mental health.
Mm-hmm.
So, if someone has a abstinence-based approach to eating, they're usually reporting that they now have cognitive resources that were previously used to think about food, now available for other things. And this is the same thing people are saying about the GLP-1 medications, the quote unquote food noise, right? People report that when you free up some of that energy, now you can use it for other things, you can get back into life. And that's what I think people really want. People, of course, have vanity goals, but I really try to help people with their sanity goals, right? Being able to get into recovery.
Got it. So are you suggesting abstinence or not? Because I heard there was the I heard a few things and I just want to make sure what your philosophy is and ask if there's any work that you do to destigmatize these foods. So even if they're present, somebody doesn't want to eat them.
Yeah, I'm not a person that has, a food addiction or an ultra processed food addiction. So I'm
Okay.
not biased by like my own experience there.
Uh-huh.
And I think one of the main things that I'm trying to offer my colleagues in my field
Mhm.
is that it's not either one of those two for the majority of people.
Uh-huh.
Going to be somewhere on the continuum or the spectrum. So
Mhm.
clinically, I don't really work with a lot of people who use an abstinence-based approach
Okay.
because
Yeah, just checking.
I don't think that they really need me, and it's not the kind of work that
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
am like highly attuned to do.
Mhm.
I've definitely worked with some of those cases, and I've worked with people who tried more of a harm reduction, low exposure, and like
Mhm.
came to the place of like, I need to do this really sort of abstinence-based approach.
Mhm.
And I didn't pathologize them, right? I wasn't like, oh, that's dieting, that's restricting. I was like,
Mhm.
I understand what you
Mhm.
are saying and I support you,
Got it.
right? As opposed to, I think some of my colleagues would say, oh no, that's just a binge waiting to happen. Um,
Mm.
and
Mhm.
so, yeah, there's nuance there. Yeah, so I think my gift to the world is not the extremes,
Mhm.
right? But like
Yeah.
really helping people understand that food plans should be dynamic,
Mm-hmm.
meaning not like, so
Mm-hmm.
overly defined,
Yep.
and that they should probably change over time.
Mm-hmm.
As we move through life and evolve, right? There's just going to be some change in evolution, and I'm more of the guy that wants to help people invite and embrace
Mm-hmm.
the change in the evolution. So I'm not into rigid food plans,
Okay.
but I'm smart enough to know that there are some people that have enough trauma to
Yeah.
where they need to be rigid. And
Okay.
right. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I mean, it's just like this incredible, intelligent dance between cognitive rigidity and cognitive fluidity and
Mm-hmm.
flexibility. And this becomes the mental health part of the work that I do, and the
Sure.
nutrition counseling is helping people understand how much structure versus, lack thereof. And
Yeah.
by the way, my background is a dietitian, but I'm not like a dietitian in the sense that like I'm all up in everyone's food and I tell them what to eat. I'm more of just a source of support. I'm just more of a coach and a scientist, and I want to bounce ideas off people and talk
Mm-hmm.
these things through. Like
Sure.
I'm way over like getting super into someone's grocery cart. You know what I mean?
Micromanaging what
I'm
they're
not into that
eating.
at
Yeah.
all. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For sure. You mentioned ultra processed foods. I'm going to dip in there and I'm sure we're just going to like start around, but I'm trying to pick out the things for clarification so that I'm on the same page. In the second paper, I believe in the first sentence, you mentioned pastries as an ultra processed food. And in the later on in the article, I think there was an example of like corn chips would be an ultra processed food.
Mm,
And to my reading, what makes an ultra processed food like pastries in France would not be. And then corn chips as well, corn oil and salt would also not be. Though, I could see perhaps a dopamine response and the context that you're sharing. So, how
mhm.
or help me
Yeah,
with
it's
those?
it's it's not just about the dopamine response. Obviously, ultra processed foods are generally produced for private profit rather than for public health. So they are engineered to be more rewarding. But I think an easier way to understand category 4 Nova ultra processed foods
Okay.
is that you generally can't look at them and identify what the food group is, what the minimally processed food group is. So if you were to look at a pastry
Okay.
or a chip, it's not obvious that it was a wheat plant or a corn on the cob per
To
se,
who?
to the naked eye as well as to the body, right?
Okay.
And the reason why people ask a lot about pastries is because one could make a pastry at home. The
Yeah.
other part of the ultra processed food definition is
Uh huh.
that these are generally foods that contain little, if any, intact category 1 foods, and are made by a series of industrial practices that
Mm-hmm.
someone generally couldn't do at home, meaning it requires a high level of technical
Right.
machinery.
Right.
So if you wanted to convert wheat into white flour, you couldn't do that. I'm sure there's someone out there that could, but you couldn't do that without some pretty high tech machinery. If you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to convert corn into a flour that you made for a chip, that would require, I'm sure, obviously, there's parts of the world where people are making corn, they're doing it. So the
Yeah.
corn
Making
one's a
corn
little bit,
tortillas.
because the
Mm-hmm.
corn is more of a whole grain than the wheat, but
Yeah.
the actual refinement of the wheat to white flour for the pastry
Okay.
is the part that makes it ultra processed food. So there's a lot of confusion, and we published a few papers, and the reviewers tend to ask some of these questions. So
Yeah.
I get a sense of like where people might be
Uh
confused.
huh. Yeah.
People are linking ultra processed foods to foods that you can't make at home, and they say, well, you can make a cake at home. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't make white flour at home. And that's
Got
the
it.
part of the cake that makes it considered, by the
Okay.
definition of the NOVA classification, a
Got it.
NOVA for ultra processed food.
Got it. And then we'll say the things that are made for profit versus the things that are made for, nourishment or however one would like to classify it. Do you think that's different, like country to country?
There's much less ultra processed foods in other countries.
I'm thinking of like the corn processing and like the wheat processing and just how other countries have that as a regular staple of their food? Do you think it's
Y-
different?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I do. I do because in
Yeah.
ultra processed food,
Uh-huh.
isn't just a factory made food. It also has to do with the packaging, the way that
Yeah.
it's branded,
Sure.
right? The way that
Oh,
it's
okay. Yeah.
stored,
Yeah.
right? So these are transnational corporations that have
Yes.
these branded snack products that
Right.
are very shelf stable that
Hmm.
you could get at a vending machine or a gas station.
Yes.
That's what ultra processed foods are, right?
Got
So
it.
it doesn't mean that a corn chip that was made in South America is an ultra processed food, but
Uh-huh.
a Dorito is an ultra processed food.
Got it.
Yeah.
I'm with you.
So the agenda in this conversation,
Oh,
financial
okay.
agenda, and this is what I like to call the commercial determinants of health. And I'm going to add one other piece about
Uh-huh.
ultra processed food.
Uh-huh.
It's not just addiction like eating pastries, cookies. It's also all the diet foods that are
Mm-hmm.
problematic. So these are
Mm-hmm.
the low calorie protein
Mm-hmm.
bars and the sugar free salad dressings and the
Yeah.
sugar free jellos and all these
Yeah.
foods that people who are subscribing to diet culture
Sure.
would tend to consume. So my pushback on ultra processed foods isn't just on highly palatable foods. It's
Yeah.
also on all these diet foods that are predatory by
Mm-hmm.
marketing toward people in larger bodies that are vulnerable and looking for solutions. So they're
Mm-hmm.
buying a low carbohydrate bread per se.
Yeah.
That's also, in my opinion, problematic from the ultra processed food perspective.
Yeah. So like the vegan meats and vegan cheeses and all that business as well.
That does technically classify as an ultra
Mm-hmm.
processed food.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little bit more sensitive there just because of the other reasons why people would eat those foods, right? Going back to
Yeah. What you
environmental
mentioned.
health and
Yeah.
so many other factors that
Yeah.
contribute. But yeah, those are also ultra processed foods. And I think
Mhm.
there was a study recently that showed that they're not as great as most people kind of thought. And I've known that for quite a while.
Yeah. From the for profit and also the role and profession as a dietitian, how do you feel about formula feeding for babies and infants?
Yeah, it's kind of like the question of, what do I think about, the pharmaceutical industry, right? There's like a lot of really positive things that come out of those efforts.
Okay.
And I think it's, very similar with what we're talking about here is that there's definitely some important needs that are filled through formula.
Okay.
But the problem that I see, and this goes back to the same as, the pharmaceutical
Mhm.
conversation, which really is the same conversation that we're having in some ways, big food, big pharma being in cahoots, right? They have the same playbook and the same way of marketing and spinning narratives and controlling the public discourse
Mhm.
around their products. The problem that I see with formula, similar to the pharmaceutical interest, it seems
Mhm.
like if someone tries to push back on it, they're made into a monster, right? Like if someone were to come out and say, you know what, I'm a proponent of breastfeeding, I think that this formula is poison,
Yeah.
right? There would be a very quick counter argument of like, you have no sensitivity to people that, need formula, mothers that can't breastfeed because they have to work, or there's just this way that people get shamed out of having strong points of view. And so
Mhm.
I don't know, I just don't have strong points of view, you know.
Mhm.
Have I seen papers that there's glyphosate in formula? Yes. Right? Do I support some of those companies that make formula? No. um, did I have a preemie at 34 weeks who needed formula? Yes. Right? So it's
Yeah.
like, okay.
Hmm.
But I believe in nutrition and breast milk, and there's a time and a place for everything. And it's like a lot of the nutrition books that are written. It's like there's a perfect person for that message. What the problem
Yeah.
is
Mhm.
these messages get extrapolated to the general population. You know what I mean?
Like
And so,
intuitive eating and
oh, intuitive eating extrapolated to the general population. But I've seen how the food companies have co-opted that message and tried to amplify it as a way of basically exonerating themselves from producing products that are harmful to human
Mhm.
health. Hmm.
I've been wanting to have the conversation about food addiction in the context of food being a biological need. And I'm wondering how you have thought about that and perhaps have those conversations.
Yeah, and it's kind of one of the main talking points against food addiction,
Okay.
right? Is that how could you become addicted to something that you need?
Hmm.
And the same argument was posed against sex addiction, which
Hmm.
is equally controversial. And there
Yeah.
does seem to be this really split in the
Hmm.
camps, right? There are
Hmm.
people that have been screaming sex addiction for decades and tried to get it into the DSM-5 and were unsuccessful because there was this really clear argument that, of course, it's rewarding because it's survival promoting, right? And so, if something is survival promoting,
Yeah.
it is therefore essential
Hmm.
to the survival of our species. Of course,
Hmm.
it's rewarding. You can't become addicted to it. But of course, the argument in the sex addiction context would be like, yes, we need some sort of intimacy to promote human species,
Hmm.
but we don't need necessarily some of the pornography and some of the other high risk behaviors that people engage in.
Hmm.
And there's a split there between people that are considered sex positive versus sex negative, right? It seems like if someone is saying I'm sex positive, then
Hmm.
there's nothing wrong with transactional sex or all these other things. Why are you pathologizing this,
Hmm.
right? And there's of course some other argument that of like, no, these are, people that are going through very difficult times in their life, and it's an obvious split. And I see the same exact split in the food addiction world,
Okay.
is that we do need food to survive. We
Hmm.
don't need ultra processed food to survive.
Okay.
So that's the other reason why I like to conceptualize it as ultra processed food addiction,
Ah, okay.
not calling it food addiction anymore, because
Uh-huh.
that argument is that we need food to survive. So let's
Okay.
call it ultra processed food addiction,
Got
because
it.
we don't need ultra processed foods to survive. And the same split is there as in the sex addiction world. There's people that are saying this is, a significant problem in my life. This should be in the DSM-5. This should needs to be in the ICD-11. And then, of course, the argument against it is if you are pointing at specific foods and calling them problematic, then you are being food negative,
Hmm.
and that we need to be food positive and body
Hmm.
positive, which
Hmm.
I tend to agree with. But that being said, just because something is necessary for survival, it doesn't mean that we can't create souped up versions of them, which are known to basically hijack the brain and make it difficult for people to regulate their intake.
Got it. I would love to ask you a case study question. I am in San Francisco and I have folks with, $93 in food stamps. And, one of the conversations about ultra processed foods or even processed foods is, when I have people living in their cars or, who are under sheltered, how do you work with folks in a way that fits their, life and budget without recommending or without, at least depathologizing ultra processed foods?
Sure. And I think the first response I have is that just because I have a point of view about ultra processed food addiction doesn't mean that I would discourage someone from eating ultra processed foods, especially
Hmm.
if it was the only thing that they could
Okay.
afford or if it made sense.
Yeah.
I eat some ultra processed foods,
Same.
and yeah, I think that
Hmm.
I think that that's the real problem with the eating disorder perspective, which is that, like, if you have a point of view about something, then you have that point of view all the way, and it's your only point of view. And I'm saying that, like, if someone has no access to a kitchen, they
Yeah.
can't store food or cook food,
Hmm.
and they're on a limited budget, they're
Hmm.
probably going to eat ultra processed foods,
Yeah.
right? And that argument that you posed, I also believe to be amplified by the food companies that are very intelligent. And I think that it pulls emotional strings of like, how can you be so insensitive to people that are from marginalized groups, people that are low income?
Hmm.
And I think that if it is true that if someone is very low income and the only thing that they can afford is ultra processed foods, then we're talking about a real systemic issue here.
Yes.
But if someone does not have access to a cauliflower or blueberries or to eat real food, then we are talking about a public health crisis that
Correct.
needs to be addressed, right?
Yes.
Are we addressing that? No, right? Can we at some point, hopefully in the future? Yes. In the time being, if someone doesn't have any other solution, they should probably figure out how to make sense out of the current food environment they live in,
Yeah.
the current situation that they are facing. So that is what we mean by harm reduction. Harm reduction means,
There
right?
we
Like,
are.
yeah, you can do what you can do, right? There is no perfect way of eating. Even people that have millions of dollars, don't have. Perfection doesn't exist, right? And yeah, I think that being gentle with food conversations and being gentle with conversations of body and economic resources is so critical. But my argument against ultra processed foods is not an argument against people. It's an argument against the mega corporations.
That is something else that I've heard people say. I think that was a lot of what Chris Van Tulloken was saying in a lot of his interviews, the for-profit of it all. I wish we had 5 hours for this conversation. And I know that you wanted to talk about mental health. You wrote and sent a second journal article about depression and its intersections with food and nutrition.
Yeah, it is the quote unquote mental health diagnosis that has the most evidence in terms of its association with ultra processed foods and the response that diet and the response that one could have by way of nutrition interventions. So we do have 7 randomized controlled trials to date that show nutrition can improve depression and depressive symptoms. And not surprisingly, all of these trials are whole food based, minimally processed food, balanced diet, eating less ultra processed foods, and they're not weight loss studies. So people always assume that there's a conflated factor there. These are studies, and not many of them were done here in the US because we just don't have that funding for that agenda. But these are studies that have been done to show people do actually improve their depressive symptoms by way of nutrition intervention. And of course, we have data showing the opposite direction, that people that eat more ultra processed foods are more likely to develop depression. So these are longitudinal studies, prospective data that show people that eat more of these foods are more likely to develop depression, and people that have interventions that are food focused are more likely to reduce in their symptomatology. And so that's the starting point. Good data, bringing it all together. The next question there is like, so what are the mechanisms? Why is it that nutrition can be so importantly linked to depression? Of course, there's vitamins and minerals. That's the obvious thing that most people think about, macronutrients and micronutrients. But of course, there's several other mechanisms, gut bacteria and its link between the brain. So we have an environment in the gut ecosystem, which is profound in terms of signaling neurotransmitters, et cetera. And then, of course, we have the immune system. And there has actually been a phenotype of depression that has been described as the inflammatory phenotype. So these are people that don't have the classic serotonin-based symptoms for their depression. It's more of a whole body inflammation response. So people that have, and these are, this is, really, really fascinating science. There's a lot of people that don't respond well to SSRIs.
Right.
And oftentimes when you actually look at what's going on with these people, they have biological systems out of balance, higher inflammatory markers. So it's pointing to a type of depression that would be particularly responsive to nutrition and diet as a intervention. And, I've been able to do this work with many people, probably doing some testing before getting a really clear path. But, Mediterranean style eating, high fiber, lots of colors, basically real foods, and getting someone to get their bowel movements regular and use lifestyle medicine, sunlight and water and whatever else we might be able to add in, movement, etc.
Hmm.
It's moving the needle on mental health disorders, depression being the first, anxiety, certainly. I've worked with a lot of people that have had PTSD, ADHD, and these are all responsive to nutrition intervention.
Yes, the ADHD I think was in the first and second article. And I am curious about whether you think you are treating ADHD and if ADHD is a condition that needs treatment.
I think that there's a biological side to a lot of these mental health diagnoses that are largely ignored. I do
Okay.
think that there's biology to ADHD, anxiety, depression that we can move the lever on a bit with what we call lifestyle medicine.
You mentioned in your studies that they go the opposite direction. So, folks who are eating more ultra processed foods are more likely to develop depression. And what do you think the role of poverty and, as you mentioned, ACEs and the things that just, would lead someone, as we've discussed, to eat
Sure.
more ultra? Yeah.
Yeah. And it's bi-directional. So ultra processed foods contributes to depression and depressive symptoms.
Hmm.
Depression and depressive symptoms contribute to ultra processed foods. People that have other social factors that cluster and co-occur with both of these.
Hmm.
But when I cite the studies that I'm talking about, these are real studies that have adjusted for a
Okay.
lot of these other social factors.
Hmm.
It's not just some, correlational study from an
Hmm.
NHANES database.
Yes.
These were like adjusted
Hmm.
for TV viewing, socioeconomic status, BMI, very high quality level of evidence that
Got it.
show there still is a signal even after adjusting for the psychosocial confounders.
Got it. Before we let you go today, what else would you like to share?
I am super excited about the future of the eating disorder field. I
Okay.
do believe that it sort of hit some dead ends in the last few years and
Mm.
that the pot's being stirred a little bit. I get a lot of messages, usually privately rather than on the electronic mailing lists, of people that have expressed frustration and the need for new energy in the field. And
Yeah.
I think that the way forward for the
Uh-huh.
eating disorder field is
Uh-huh.
going to be to integrate with this data we have on ultra processed food addiction, depression, anxiety, rather than just cleave itself off and stay in its own bubble, in its own silo. The eating
Mhm.
disorder field needs to integrate with nutritional psychiatry, nutritional psychology. And I'm trying really hard to be a peacemaker and bring different scientists together to
Mhm.
start thinking about ways that we can be teammates rather than ops, right? There's just way too much opposition in the field. And it's sad to me. And one of the ways that I am able to contribute is through obviously the clinical work that I do at my practice, nutrition and recovery, the academic papers that I write and will continue to write. I actually have a few more coming from data that I collected in my own practice, right? Which
Nice.
is super
Yeah.
exciting.
Yeah.
My app, I built an app, Wise My Nutrition, which is
Tell me
really
about it.
designed to create a conversation around nutrition for mental health that
Mhm.
teaches people about gut health and brain health
Okay.
and eating food for mood and brain
Mhm.
health. So, not calories, not macros. It's an entirely new framework. And
Mhm.
I put a lot of intentional energy to make it eating disorder informed, trauma informed, which means that
Mhm.
it's a safe place, right?
Yeah.
It's not a diet. It doesn't tell people what to do. It's like a little educational journey where
Mhm.
someone could come in and do some assignments, log their food, share it with their coaches, providers, etc. And it's
Mhm.
extremely robust and it's relatively new. And I'm super excited about it. It's brought to Apple and Google in their app stores and
Yeah.
still working on it, just making it better. So taking feedback from my users and from my clinicians that are
Mhm.
using it. I have a lot of mental health therapists that are using it with their clients because there's just an unreliable collaboration with dietitians, it seems. So I sort of built the app to give someone an opportunity to, seek some lifestyle medicine support for depression or trauma
Mhm.
without feeling like they were pathologized from a mainstream eating disorder dietitian.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on. You have opened up like 500 episodes, follow-up episodes that I need to do right now. So I appreciate that. And I appreciate everything that you had to share.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Hopefully I can be on one of your future episodes.
Oh, I am positive.
Let's
Take
do it.
care. Thanks again to David for coming on the show. You can learn more about how he sees the intersection of nutrition and mental health at Wise Mind Nutrition, and you can explore his mobile app. And again, if you'd like to share your thoughts on this episode, you can send an email or voice memo to makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com. And let me know if I'm able to share your name with your feedback on the pod. If you've got a few seconds to spare, the easiest way to support the show is by rating and reviewing it. A recent review titled, "Every episode is a favorite," says that each conversation brings a bit of realness, humor, and much needed discussion. You can also contribute to the sustainability of this podcast by becoming a Patreon member of the show and supporting the work of our incredibly thoughtful editor, Jen Jacobs. My next week's guest was inspired to come on the show after hearing my episode with Kent Thomas. He's an infectious disease nurse practitioner specializing in HIV, and I get to talk to him about PrEP and the queer community. Until next time, friends, make it awkward. This has been Making It Awkward. I'm your host, Jessica Wilson. This is a production of The Body Politic. It's sponsored by Patreon members and the Legacy of Sacramento Outboard Services.